History tells us Herod Antipas was the ruler and John was the prisoner. But if you look closely, the opposite starts to appear. One man sat behind cold stone walls and still walked free before God, while the other sat on a throne and became a slave to his own pride. Herod was trapped by a public promise and the memory of a man he just couldn't silence. This was the most expensive cover-up in the entire Herodian house, and the bill didn't stop at the palace gates. It shows us the same pressure that still works on people today, where we feel the need to protect our comfort and our image, even if our conscience has to pay for it. Why did a ruler with an army and prison walls still fear one prophet's voice? What was he trying so hard to keep buried? To find that out, we have to leave the prison cell for a minute and step into the royal court that put John there in the first place. Mark describes this scene with so much pressure packed into just a few lines. Let me read it for you plainly. For Herod himself had sent forth and laid upon John, and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. For John had said unto Herod, It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. Therefore Herodias had a quarrel against him, and would have killed him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and an holy, and observed him, and when he had heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Think about the tension in that room. Herod has arrested John. John has been calling him out, and Herodias wants John dead. Herod actually fears John and protects him for a while, even listening to him while the whole situation keeps getting worse. It doesn't feel like a side note in history. It feels tight and unstable, like everyone in the room knows something has gone wrong, but nobody wants to face it honestly. The Herod in this story is Herod Antipas, who was one of Herod the Great's sons. He ruled Galilee and Perea as a tetrarch under Rome, which is a detail that really matters because he wasn't a fully sovereign king. He held power, but it was borrowed power. Rome let him stay in charge as long as he kept the peace and didn't create problems too big to manage. When John speaks against him, he isn't just confronting a private man having a rough marriage. He is confronting a public leader whose personal choices could shake an entire region. John wasn't just some strange preacher from the wilderness with rough clothes and a hard message. The historian Josephus actually describes him as a good man who called people to live right, and he says the crowds were deeply moved by him. John carried massive moral weight with ordinary people. When he spoke, people listened, and Herod knew that. Even after John was shut inside the fortress of Machaerus, the prison below and the palace above told the whole story. John felt the cost in his body, but Herod felt the threat in his court. It's like a worker who spots fraud in a company report and refuses to sign off on it. The office might call that person difficult or even disloyal, but the real problem isn't the warning. The problem is that one honest voice can make a whole corrupt system feel seen. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been that person in the room who saw what everyone else wanted to ignore? If that's you, put truth in the comments right now. Then came the actual scandal. And this is where the hidden fallout starts to get messy. Antipas had been married to the daughter of a neighboring king for years. That marriage was political. It kept the peace on a tense border, and it protected his standing with his neighbors. But Antipas left her and arranged to marry Herodias instead. Josephus tells us that Herodias left her own husband while he was still alive just to join Antipas. The damage didn't stay inside the palace walls. Antipas's first wife fled back to her father, and that insult helped push the entire region toward a bloody war. So when John steps in, he isn't only naming a sin in the bedroom. He's speaking to a court where private appetite has already turned into a public danger. That is exactly why his voice feels so disruptive. Herod has lit a political fuse, and John refuses to act like it's just a private family matter. John's rebuke is simple and sharp. It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. The way Mark writes this suggests that John kept saying it over and over. This wasn't just one brave outburst at a party. He kept bringing that same truth back into the room every time he was heard. A truth teller doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes faithfulness is just saying the same clean sentence again while everyone else tries to move on. That sentence carried weight because John wasn't speaking from personal disgust or his own preference. He was standing on a law that Herod simply could not edit. That takes us deeper than just a scandal. The real issue here is whether a ruler can treat God's commands like they don't apply to him. When John looks at Herod and says, "It is not lawful," he isn't just sharing an opinion or venting his frustration. He isn't talking about personal taste or repeating some juicy palace rumor. He is speaking the language of the Torah. He's holding Herod up against God's own standard and saying, very simply, that this marriage doesn't count. John isn't trying to give the king some helpful life advice. He is announcing that the man in charge has stepped over a line that God drew a long time ago. The real weight of that charge comes straight out of Leviticus. If you look at Leviticus 18:16, it clearly forbids a man from taking his brother's wife. And Leviticus 20:21 actually calls that act a defilement. So when John speaks, his words are heavy with covenant meaning. He isn't just making up a strict rule because he has a problem with Herod. He is trying to bring the ruler back under a law that Herod should have known by heart. Now there is one detail that sometimes trips people up. Deuteronomy 25 mentions an exception called Levirate marriage. That's where a man dies without having children, and his brother marries the widow to keep the family line going. But that specific case doesn't fit here at all. And that's exactly why John's rebuke carries so much weight. The historian Josephus helps us see the full picture. Herodias didn't come to Antipas as a grieving widow of a childless brother. She actually left a husband who was still very much alive, and they already had a daughter together. The exception didn't apply. Because of that, John's words aren't extreme or radical. They are just precise. He is telling Herod that royal desire doesn't give you a pass to ignore God's law. And let's be real, that lands pretty close to home for all of us. Herod's downfall didn't start with a sword or a big military blunder. It started when his appetite crossed the line, and he convinced himself the line didn't really matter. That is how most ruin begins. It's usually not one massive, explosive act, but one small compromise that we welcome, then defend, and eventually build our whole lives around it. Luke actually pulls the camera back even further. He tells us that John rebuked Herod not just because of Herodias, but because of all the evil things that Herod had done. That one line is so important because it keeps us from thinking this is just a story about a marriage dispute. The marriage was a big deal, and John hit it head on. But Luke shows us there was a much bigger pattern of behavior. The mess in Herod's house was connected to a much longer moral record. John's message touched the whole man, not just one relationship. That explains why the message felt so dangerous to the people in power. When the truth exposes one single mistake, people can usually find a way to contain it. They call it a misunderstanding, a lapse in judgment, or a one-time slip-up. But when that same truth starts revealing a pattern, the stakes go through the roof. Suddenly, the issue isn't just one bad decision. The issue is the kind of person Herod has actually become. Think about the way John handles this. He doesn't try to build a brand out of being a rebel. He doesn't perform for the cameras or act out on his rage. He just keeps coming back to that one faithful line because the line is true. Anyone can find a burst of courage for 5 minutes. It takes something much deeper to stay steady when everyone else in the room has already decided they want you to be quiet. Some of the strongest truth tellers you will ever meet aren't the loudest people in the room. They are just the ones who refuse to keep a lie alive. Once John framed the issue as unlawful, Herod couldn't just treat it like a PR problem or bad publicity. The problem moved inside his heart, and that is where the story gets really unsettling. Mark gives us one of the strongest details in this whole account, and it's the one thing that explains why Herod didn't just kill John immediately. The Bible says Herod actually feared John. It wasn't just because the crowds were listening to him, though that was definitely part of it. Mark says Herod knew John was a righteous and holy man, so he kept him safe for a while and even listened to him. The ruler wasn't just dealing with a voice he could ignore. He knew there was something clean and honest in John that he didn't have in himself. That is what makes Herod so much more than just a one-dimensional villain. A flat villain would have mocked John and walked away. Herod couldn't do that. He kept going back to listen, and Mark tells us he was deeply perplexed. Some translations even say he heard John gladly. Just picture that for a second. The man with all the authority keeps visiting the prisoner because the prisoner has a moral clarity that the king can't find anywhere else in his own court. This is exactly how a conscience works. It doesn't just point a finger and accuse you. It keeps pressing on that one sore spot that won't go away. A person can fight against repentance and still know, deep down, that the voice in front of them is telling the truth. Herod wasn't confused because John was being vague. He was divided because John was being crystal clear. And he knew that obeying the truth would cost him way too much. So let's be honest for a minute. Are you listening to a truth right now that you still refuse to obey? If a truth keeps hitting the same spot and it won't leave you alone, don't try to run from it. That might actually be the mercy of God showing you exactly where the change needs to start. Josephus gives us a look at the pressure building up around his inner struggle. From the outside, Herod was terrified of John's influence over the public, so he was getting hit from two sides at the same time. Publicly, John looked like a threat because the people followed him. Privately, John felt like a threat because Herod was following him too. He kept returning to the very voice that made him uncomfortable, hoping he could hear the truth without actually having to change his life. That mixture of feelings is a big deal. You can manage political fear with guards, prison cells, and distance. You can't do that with a guilty conscience. Once the truth gets inside of you, it keeps talking long after the room goes quiet. Herod didn't need more information or a better explanation. He had already heard more than enough. The only real question was whether he would bow down to the truth he already recognized. You can see the damage this caused later on when Herod starts hearing reports about Jesus. His very first reaction is that John has been raised from the dead. This tells you the voice never really left his head. Some people don't fight the truth because they think it's a lie. They fight it because they know it has described them perfectly. Look at the contrast Mark quietly sets up for us. Herod has the title, the soldiers, the palace, and the power to lock a man in a hole. John has absolutely none of that. Yet the man who is actually free is John. It's not because prison is easy, but because his conscience is settled before God. Herod is the one in chains, and those chains are on the inside. He hears the truth, he knows it's right, and he still won't give in. So his own will splits in two and starts working against itself. This is where the story opens up for all of us. It becomes a study in what happens to power when a conscience stays awake but repentance never shows up. He wants John close enough to listen to, but he doesn't want him close enough to obey. That kind of divided life never stays in one place for long. Sooner or later, the weakness you hide in private turns into violence in public. And that is exactly where this story is headed. Once Herod's messy conscience moved into the public eye, everything got a lot more dangerous. Mark tells us that Herodias held a massive grudge against John and wanted him dead. But the gospel never lets Herod hide behind his wife's anger. Let's be real. Herod was the one who arrested John. He was the one who kept him locked up. And he was the one who finally sent the execution order. Herodias wanted blood, but the violence of the state still ran through the ruler's hands. Think about the birthday banquet Mark describes with such careful detail. Herod gathers his top officials, his military commanders, and all the big names in Galilee. This isn't just some private dinner but a room full of the people who kept him in power. These are the men who watch him, measure him, and decide if he's still fit to lead. Every word he says now carries weight, and every reaction gets noticed by the crowd. In a room like that, showing weakness becomes incredibly expensive because pride is suddenly a public performance. Then the trap closes on him. The daughter of Herodias dances. Herod speaks way too fast, and he makes a massive oath in front of everyone. Mark says he was deeply grieved when the request for John's head came. He isn't confused about what's right, and he knows this request is ugly and wrong. You can almost feel the room change as the smell of food and wine turns sour the moment those words land. Then come the eyes. All those commanders and leading men are watching to see if the ruler will hold his pose. He chose his image over an innocent man's life, paying for a public reputation with the prophet's blood. The crowd didn't force his hand, but they definitely exposed what was actually ruling his heart. It's not much different from a leader today who builds a polished public brand online or on a stage. They feel like they can't admit failure because their whole image depends on never looking weak. Once the brand starts ruling the man, honesty feels like a total collapse. Public pressure makes sin more stubborn because pride starts performing for the cameras. Leaders double down not because they are sure they are right, but because too many eyes are on them. Mark also places this dark story in a bigger frame. John's death sits right between the sending of the 12 disciples and their return. That placement matters because it shows us that while the message of repentance is going out, the world is pushing back. Right in the middle of the mission, Mark stops to show what happens to the one who speaks for God in front of power. This is a warning that the mission doesn't move through a neutral world. There is another shadow here too. A ruler sees an innocent man, knows something is wrong, and still caves under the pressure. We see that same pattern show up later when Jesus stands before political authority. John's death isn't the cross, but is definitely pointing in that direction. Then we see a strange reversal. Herod got what he wanted, which was silence. Or at least he thought he did. But the man with the prison lost control of the story, and the man in the cell kept speaking long after he was gone. The historian Josephus gives this aftermath a really hard edge. Later on, when Herod suffered a major military defeat, many people saw it as a judgment for what he did to John. Whether Herod admitted it or not, the public memory certainly did. People remembered the murder, they remembered the prophet, and they remembered who actually had a clean heart. And that's the center of the whole thing. History remembered the prisoner with more honor than the ruler. John lost his life, but he never lost his witness. Herod kept his court for a little while longer, but his name stayed tied to compromise, fear, and the killing of a good man. Let me press this home for a second. Herod chose his image, and he kept paying for it. John lost what the world counts as valuable and still kept a clean conscience before God. A truthful life might cost you something early on, but a false life keeps charging you interest forever. That banquet is long gone, but the pattern is still here. The same pressure shows up today in places where honesty threatens the status quo and the person calling out the wrong gets treated like they are the problem. This story doesn't stay in the palace. It turns around and looks at us. You can see this pattern in churches all the time. Someone speaks plainly about hypocrisy, abuse, or secret misconduct, and instead of asking if the charge is true, the leader starts asking who said it. They worry about how it was said and how fast they can contain the damage. The person naming the wound gets treated like they are the wound itself. That's not a new tactic. Truth always threatens the arrangement, so the arrangement always strikes back. The same thing happens at work. A team can get used to half-truths, buried numbers, or manipulative leadership. The moment one person speaks clearly, everyone feels exposed. It's not because the truth is confusing, but because it disturbs the comfort people build around the problem. Promotions and group loyalty start pulling harder than honesty does. Suddenly, the clean voice gets labeled as difficult, disloyal, or even unsafe. You see it in public leadership too. And this isn't about one political party or another. It's about image. Leaders get so trained to manage appearances that their conscience gets negotiated away one small decision at a time. They start editing reality for the sake of optics and protect the messaging instead of their integrity. They don't always deny the wrong because they can't see it. Sometimes they deny it because admitting it would cost too much under the weight of everyone's expectations. Family systems do this as well. Maybe more quietly, but just as deeply. Picture a dinner table where everyone knows dad drinks too much and turns cruel at night, but nobody says a word. Then one grown son finally says, "We keep acting like this is normal, but it's tearing the house apart." The plates are still there, and someone stops chewing. Nobody looks up. Suddenly, that son is the problem. Not because he lied, but because he broke the family agreement to keep the truth buried. So which one are you in your family? Are you the peacemaker? Or are you the one finally naming the truth? Put that in the comments if you're willing to share. The issue here isn't just about wicked rulers in ancient courts. It's about ordinary people, ordinary pleasures, and ordinary fears. Most of us will never sit on a throne, but all of us know what it feels like to face a crowd and wonder if telling the truth is worth the cost. That's where the story lands, right in our conscience. So here's the deal. Tell the truth without the theatrics. You don't need to perform courage or turn your honesty into a big show. Just speak cleanly. Name what is wrong and let the truth stand on its own 2 feet. Guard your conscience before compromise starts feeling like a normal Tuesday. Sin rarely arrives announcing itself with a trumpet. It settles in through repetition, small adjustments, and little excuses. If you wait until your soul feels numb, the work gets a lot harder. Answer God early, keep short accounts, and stay tender toward Him. Fear God more than you fear the crowd. That is the real dividing line. Crowds change, moods shift, and systems fall apart. God doesn't. If you live for the approval of the people in front of you, you'll keep bending until you break. If you live before God, you can stay straight even when the pressure turns cold. So let me ask you directly, where have you been helping a lie survive because telling the truth might cost you some comfort? That depth of the soul doesn't get any smaller by hiding it. Herod had the high walls, the big title, and the guards at the door. But John had the truth, and those walls just couldn't silence it. Here is the thing you really can't miss. If you have been trying to speak honestly in your family, at your church, or in a workplace that punishes clean words, you need to know you are not alone. There is still a remnant of people who fear God more than they fear the room. And every time one of those people stands clean, John's voice keeps echoing. So please, do not bury what God is pressing on your heart right now. I want you to bring one hidden compromise into the light this week and take one clear step of obedience. If that is you, type "I choose the truth" in the comments to let that be your marker today. If you want to stand with a community that would rather keep a clean conscience than protect their life, subscribe to the channel. This is a place for people learning to stay steady when truth actually costs you something. Then go ahead and watch the next video. Not just for more content, but for training and equipping. Courage does not grow in the moment of pressure because it grows long before the pressure hits.